record this so that people can watch it on our website as well. And thank you to Dr. Liebman for letting me do that. To introduce myself, I am Chris Hall, the chair of Derek, as honestly I know that you all know. I'm very pleased to welcome Laura Liebman tonight to discuss her book, Once We Were Slaves. The chat function is available for you to ask questions of our author, so please take advantage of that during the talk, and we'll ask those questions at the end. The series is produced by Derek, Beth Shalom Center for Pluralistic, Engaging Learning, and Transformational Jewish Experiences. Tonight's book, Once We Were Slaves, is available for purchase through White Whale, and I'll be posting a link to that in the chat a few times tonight. Dr. Liebman is made available through the Jewish Book Council, and this program is funded by Seth Glick and Carolyn Slayton. I want to thank the organizers of tonight's program, Sandy Hirsch, Seth Glick, Fern Steckel, Natalie Rosenblum, and Rabbi Goodman. Laura Liebman is a professor of English and Humanities at Reed College. Her work focuses on how material culture changes our understanding of the role of women, children, and Jews of color in the early Atlantic world. She's been a Fulbright Scholar at the University of Panama and the University of Utrecht in the Netherlands, a visiting fellow at the Oxford Center for Hebrew and Jewish Studies at the University of Oxford, and the Leon Levy Foundation Professor of Jewish Material Culture at Bard Graduate Center. Dr. Liebman is the author of The Art of the Jewish Family, A History of Women in Early New York in 5 Objects, Messianism, Secrecy, and Mysticism, A New Interpretation of Early American Jewish Life, and several other works, and of course, the book she's here to discuss tonight, Once We Were Slaves. I will pass it over to you, Dr. Liebman. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me. I'm going to be showing images. If for some reason you can't see them, let me know, as it will be much easier to follow the presentation with them than without them. So the story I'm going to tell you about tonight involves 2 central people. One was named Sarah Brandon Moses and her brother, Isaac Lopez Brandon. And the 2 of them began their lives poor, Christian, and enslaved on the island of Barbados at the end of the 18th century. But less than 30 years later, they had become some of New York's wealthiest Jewish elites. And over the course of their lives, as they moved around the Atlantic world, they had their race reclassified from being people of color to being white. Tonight, I'm going to talk to you about their remarkable journey around the Atlantic world and how that racial transformation came to be. Through the course of their story, I'm hoping you're going to take away 3 main things. One is really just something about their lives. And I think they're a really good example of how people who weren't particularly famous at all during their own lifetimes can still be fascinating to us later, looking back into history. The second thing that I hope you'll take away is really something about the nexus of Jews and race during this crucial time period in American history at the end of the 18th century and the first couple of decades in the 19th century. And this is a time when Jews were increasingly finding themselves racialized. But I really want to focus tonight on what is the Jewish aspect of the story of racially ambiguous people during this time period. So you may have heard stories about people who have partial African ancestry, who were racially ambiguous, told under what's called passing. And recently there was a Netflix version of Nella Larsen's novel of that same name. And stories of passing usually imply that somebody was born into a race and then they left that area behind and went someplace else and hid their past from everybody. And in doing so, were able to be understood as being part of a different race. And what I really want to emphasize that for tonight is that for Jewish people during this time period, that kind of story wasn't really possible. And that's because the Jewish networks around the Atlantic world were so tight that every single place that Sarah and Isaac went, there were people from the Barbadian Jewish community who knew about their past. So for Jews who were multiracial and racially ambiguous, there really wasn't an option to just leave their past behind. But nonetheless, they were able to have their race changed. And so I think it's really important to think about, why is it during this time period that race has that kind of fluidity? The third thing, other than that kind of racial fluidity, particularly for Jews, and also the issue of just something about their lives that I'd like you to take away, is something about the larger history of multiracial Jews in the United States. Many of you may have seen recent surveys of American Jewish communities that emphasize the diversity of American Jewish communities today, and some of those range in terms of data from being maybe 9% of Jewish communities up to maybe 25% of Jewish communities are people who don't identify as white. But most of the discussion of multiracial Jews has happened more since the 1970s. And I'm hoping through Sarah and Isaac's story tonight that you'll be able to push that history farther back in time and really think about the longer history of the diversity of American Judaism. So, with those three things in mind, I'd like to turn to the place where Sarah and Isaac were born, which is in the southeastern part of the Caribbean on the island of Barbados. Sarah and Isaac were born to a Sephardic father named Abraham Rodriguez Brandon, who by the end of his life was the wealthiest Jew on the island of Barbados. And he was somebody who owned vast amounts of property as well as being a highly successful merchant. Their mother, however, had a very different sort of life. She also grew up in a Sephardic household, but not because they were her kin, but because she was enslaved to them. So the family she grew up in were called the Lopezes, and they were friends of Abraham Rodriguez Brandon. And the couple had not only Sarah and Isaac, but also at least two other children who appear to have died in childhood. Well, Abraham Rodriguez Brandon had a number of different plantations that he owned. The children and their mother weren't born on any of those plantations, but rather were born in the main port of Bridgetown along a street called Swan Street. And if you could see underneath here, it says in very faint letters, or Jew Street. And that's because it was a street that many Jews lived along and engaged in market activities. It was a favorite street for Jews, not only because it had lots of shops where they could sell their wares, but also because it was located right near the Nida Israel Synagogue, where both the Lopez family and the Brandons belonged. That congregation was the spiritual home of the siblings' father, who at various points in his life was not only on the synagogue governance board, but was actually the parnas, or president of the congregation. So in addition to being very wealthy, he's really central to the island's Jewish life. Unlike Abraham Rodriguez Brandon, however, the Lopez family were kind of middling Jews. They also belonged to the synagogue, but they weren't quite as fancy. Instead, they lived in one of these small apartments above a shop owned by the family, similar to these structures that we see taken along Swan Street in the late part of the 19th century. And we know that the Lopez family owned at least two different shops along Swan Street. One was a goldsmith and silversmith shop, and the other was a kind of every goods store where you could buy fabric or fiddle strings or food. And this actually proved really helpful to me because remarkably, the record book for that particular shop survived and is now in New York. So I was able to find out really mundane but fascinating things, such as what did they eat each week, which is the kind of thing when, if you're interested in objects, fantasizes you'll learn about the past, but is often very hard to find out. While the siblings were born into this Sephardic household, when it came time to have their births recognized, their mother took them not to the synagogue, but to the local Anglican church, which is today known as St. Michael's Cathedral, though at that time it was called St. Michael's Church. And she took Sarah there in 1793 in order to be baptized. And she did this for a few reasons. The first one is that because she and her mother and her grandmother were all enslaved, they didn't have a lineage that was considered Jewish to the community at the time. And so Sarah and Isaac were born being considered not Jewish, and hence couldn't have their births registered at the synagogue. And during this time period, um, it was very uncommon for people to be able to be converted to Judaism. So if they weren't born Jewish, very unlikely had they stayed on the island that they ever could have become Jewish. The other reason why their mother, however, took Sarah to the church in order to have her baptized was that baptism was really a privilege which was only recently available to people with African ancestry on the island. And it was something which, had Sarah stayed on the island, would have allowed her one day to actually have a legal marriage, which is something that neither her mother nor her grandmother or her great grandmother were ever able to accomplish. And that kind of marriage would have allowed her a kind of safety against the people she lived in and amongst, particularly white men. So by taking her to the church, her mother was really trying to offer her daughter opportunities that she herself didn't have. However, by taking her to the church, she also had to submit Sarah to the race making processes on the island, because as soon as Sarah's name gets entered into the church records books, they also give her a race or assign her a race. And she was assigned as being somebody who is multiracial, but a person of color. And had she stayed on the island, that racial designation would have stayed with her her entire life and not been something that ever could have changed. So, really important that eventually she's able to leave the island, for otherwise her story would be quite different. So, after this baptism, Sarah and her brother live in and around Swan Street until 1801, when Sarah is only 3 years old. Two remarkable things happen that change the siblings' lives completely. And the first of those is their mother's white Anglican father dies. And he is a gentleman who lived very nearby, on just off of Back Church Street, and owned a couple of different houses. And while he had a couple of families by women of color, he had no legitimate children. In most cases like this, he would have then left all of his property to his white relations. But he instead does something really, really unusual, which is he decides to leave Sarah's and Isaac's mother and her brothers one of his houses near Back Church Street. And this really radically transforms them and sets them apart from the vast majority of people who are enslaved around Bridgetown, because it means that Sarah and Isaac's mother goes from somebody who's considered a piece of property herself to being somebody who owns property. So a really radical transformation in terms of what her life could eventually work out to include. The location of that house, however, was also really important, because it was located right near the old churchyard, where very shortly after they inherited the house would be built St. Mary's Church. And this would become the place where the wealthy free people of color attended services in Bridgetown. And so the very location of the house sort of sets them up to rise up in terms of social status in the Bridgetown community. It was also located, however, near where very shortly after they inherited the house would be built the Methodist Church. And this is where the kinds of methods I used in writing this history become really, really important. So when I first started tracing the family's lines, I was really determined that I would try and trace the mother's line as much as the father's line. So even though the mother didn't have any known Jewish ancestors, I really wanted to make sure I was giving a voice to what was going on in her family as well. And this turned out to be a really important instinct, because through the siblings' mother, the siblings are related to the first female national hero of Barbados, a woman named Anne Jordan Gill, or later she was called Sarah Ann Gill. And she was known as being this heroine of Barbados because she used the Methodist Church in order to gain civil rights for both free and enslaved people of color. And for me, this was monumental. Not only did it mean that they were related to this really, really important figure in Barbadian history, but also it helped me understand the larger role that struggles for civil rights continue to play in the family's history. And in particular, um, Isaac Lopez Brandon would himself become involved in civil rights disputes on the island, particularly those arguing for Jews to have the right to vote. So, just to quickly go over what I've covered so far, um, here's Sarah Brandon. Here's her brother Isaac Lopez Brandon, born in 1798, 1792. Here are those two sisters that died in childhood. Here's their mother, Sarah Esther Gill, their father, Abraham Rodriguez Brandon, and through their mother, brother, they're related to this first female national hero of Barbados. And I was able to trace back not only the siblings' grandmother, Jemima Lopez, but also one more generation back to a woman named Deborah Lopez. And Deborah, Jemima, Sarah, her three brothers, and all of these four children were all enslaved to the Lopez family in Barbados. So, not a particularly wealthy family, but they enslaved a fair number of people. And then here's the other family through that white Anglican grandfather through their mother's father that left the house to these people. So that was the first big thing that happened to change Sarah and Isaac's family's lives, the inheriting of this house that set them up in terms of their social status and their path to freedom on the island. The second big thing that happened, however, is that their father in 1801, the same year the grandfather died, took them back to that St. Michael's Church and paid not only the Lopez family to allow him to now own his children, but also paid the church in order to have his children eternally be free. So they were manumitted according to Barbadian law. And this was a phenomenal opportunity for the children and very, very unusual during this time period. Most people who are enslaved in Barbados would have to wait until 1834 when general emancipation hit the island. And had that been the case for Isaac and Sarah, Isaac would have already been in his 40s by the time that he was made free, as opposed to being a child. And Sarah would have been a grown woman as well and would have already had all of her children, which means that not only was she freed at this moment, but all of her children going forward were freed as well, as opposed to having to wait to see her children also growing up in slavery. So, a really monumental thing that her father pays for their freedom and allows them to have this new path in their lives. So again, the children might have grown up like many of the people who that small, lucky group of people who were living in and around Swan Street, who had managed to get their freedom before general emancipation, who might have ties to either the Anglican Church or the Methodist Church, and maybe also had some ties to the synagogue, but were perpetually at the margins of the synagogue because there wasn't this ability to convert and become part of it. But finally, when Isaac is less than 20 years old, he decides that isn't the life he wants for himself. And instead of wanting to be at the margins of the synagogue, like many of the other people who had ties through family members to the synagogue, but also having African ancestry, he decides that he wants to formally convert and become part of the Jewish community. And in order to do that, Isaac and his younger sister Sarah, who's only about 13 at the time, decides to leave the island and travel south to the nearby colony of Suriname. Now, today's Suriname might not be the most obvious place where people would go to convert to Judaism, so I think it's worth saying, like, why did they go to Suriname? So you'll notice it's actually pretty close to Barbados, but even more importantly, along with this little peanut-shaped island off the coast of Venezuela, Suriname and Curacao have the two largest Jewish communities in all of the Americas, so many times larger than New York, and much, much better infrastructure than any of the US Jewish communities had during this time period. But of these two communities, Curacao and Suriname, Suriname also had the distinctive aspect of having the largest multiracial Jewish community in all of the Americas. So it's a much more welcoming place for the siblings to go in order to convert to Judaism. The reason for that large standing multiracial Jewish community lay not primarily in Paramaribo, that main port where the siblings would decide to settle for a year, but rather downriver to this town called Yoden Savannah, or Jew Savannah, which was a town that was set up starting in the 17th century primarily by Jews and for Jews. It was a plantation town, but it was run according to Jewish law as much as they possibly could. So, for example, they put the synagogue on the highest point in the town, and they also laid out the streets to look like the pattern of the tribes around the tabernacle in the book of Exodus. So they're really trying to like build a new Jerusalem in the forest. The other thing that they did, however, was really pay attention to what the Bible said about how Jews should be treating enslaved peoples. And this meant that, unlike in many other communities, they started both circumcising and converting enslaved people, particularly if those enslaved people happened to have a Sephardic father or an Ashkenazi father. So if their father was Jewish, much more likely that they would end up being converted. So by the time the siblings arrived in Paramaribo in 1811, there's already this very large, long-standing community of people who have at least one African ancestor. And one scholar has suggested that perhaps as much as half of the community would have had at least one African ancestor by this time period. So when the siblings come to Paramaribo, they arrive in this big, bustling community with a lot of diversity. And it's so diverse, in fact, that they actually have a choice of which synagogue they want to go to, which is very unusual for the Americas during this time period. And they choose to go to the Portuguese congregation. And that makes a certain amount of sense because the Portuguese congregation, or the Western Sephardic synagogue, was the synagogue that their father would have belonged to because he was a Portuguese Jew. So they have this sort of ancestral tie to it. But if they hadn't had that tie, it certainly would have been the congregation that most people would have chosen to convert to during this time period. And that's because for most Jews in early America, Sephardic Jews were the classy kind of Jews, like the Jews you wanted to be. So really important that they have this sort of in with the in crowd. And in fact, we find even in the Portuguese records that the word used for talking about Ashkenazi Jews, tudesco, is also the word used for servants. So you get the sense of like Ashkenazi Jews are those like lower class Jews. Some of you may have seen the interior of this building today. Well, actually, I'm not quite sure what it's being used to for today, but last time I was in Suriname, it was being used for an internet cafe. I don't even know if we have internet cafes anymore, but they were able to do that because the interior of that synagogue was rented out to the Israel Museum in Jerusalem. And so some of you may have seen that interior, but it would have been obviously in sight when they came there. And Isaac came before the Ma'amad, the governance board, and made his plea to be able to convert. And after a certain amount of time, was given permission not only to convert, but to be ritually circumcised by one of the many mohels living in Paramaribo at the time. Following that circumcision, the pair of siblings would have gone to the small building in the synagogue complex, but behind the synagogue, which is more recently been used for like the Kiddush and stuff like that. But underneath this front room, there is a trapdoor which led to a ritual bath, which at the time would have been filled with pristine water. And one by one, they would have gone down, immersed in the ritual bath, and then come back up halakhically Jewish, that is, Jewish according to Jewish law. And sometimes I'll get questions from people like, and was a conversion from Suriname a good conversion? And I think that's a useful question. Like, did other people accept this? And the answer is yes. So interestingly enough, if you converted in New York or Philadelphia, it wasn't always accepted if you traveled back to Europe or to London. Not so with Suriname. Everybody knew that those were good conversions. Again, a much larger Jewish community. Suriname ends up providing many of the early rabbis or hazans for U.S. Jewish communities during the 19th century. So I mentioned that they had a choice of where they could go to have this conversion take place. And that's because Paramaribo was one of the first places in the Americas to have an Ashkenazi synagogue. But as we already learned, the Ashkenazi Jews were not considered quite as good as the other Jews, at least by the Sephardic Jews. And in fact, if somebody from the Sephardic community, if a man married a woman from the Ashkenazi synagogue, he would be demoted in his own congregation to a second class status. Obviously, this is not like according to Jewish law, but just what they were doing. And he would no longer be able to be called up to the Torah. He would be buried in the bad part of the cemetery, all these sorts of things. So there were a lot of pressure not to marry people between the two different congregations. But both of these congregations, both the High German or Ashkenazi congregation and the Portuguese congregation, also discriminated against other Jews, again, not according to Jewish law, but just according to practice. And those were the Jews who were considered Jews of color during this time period. So I had mentioned that about half the people had African ancestry of some sort in the Jewish community by 1811 when the siblings arrived, but not all of those people were considered Jews of color. And that's because race worked really differently in Suriname than it did in Barbados. So in Barbados, I had mentioned, had Sarah stayed there, there was something similar to the one drop rule. Any African ancestry, you were always a person of color. There's no way to change that. But in Suriname, if you were somebody who had 7 out of your 8 great grandparents were from Europe, you could either be white or a person of color. So if your parents were married, you were white. If they were unmarried, you were a person of color according to the local laws. And this is not just in the synagogue, this is throughout the entire colony. And if your parents married after you were born, you could have your race change. So your race would be changed from being a person of color to being white. And this meant that there were a number of people in the community who were white but also had African ancestors. And because of this role that marriage played in trying to determine who was considered actually white in the colony, we see Jews adapting their ritual practices in order to deal with the local race laws. And again, this is completely contrary to Jewish law, but one of the key places that they do that is in their marriage contracts. And this is an example of one of these contracts where the race of the person is being marked in the marriage contract in ways that we really don't find in other places. And they did it in a very interesting way. Many early Jewish documents from the colonies, if they want to talk about people of African descent, they'll talk about them as Cushites or use some kind of biblical term for people from Africa, but not so in these marriage contracts. In the marriage contracts, they instead use a phrase that translates as emancipated Jews, meaning they were Jews who had either themselves been enslaved or who had ancestors who were enslaved. So they're not a different race. They're Jews who had this kind of taint of slavery with them. And those emancipated Jews, like the men who married the Ashkenazi Jews, were completely discriminated against. They were the second class members of either one of the two congregations, such that they could not be called up to the Torah for honors. They had to sit in the bad seats in the synagogue. When they died, they were buried in the swampy part of the cemetery where your grave was more likely to sink and your gravestone would disappear. And they couldn't vote in any of the synagogue elections to change any of that. So really, we start to have this second class tier of Jews within the community. And I think this helps us understand why, although the community was welcoming in some ways of converts, why Sarah and Isaac might have decided not to stay in Suriname, but instead, following their conversion, actually leave this colony. because had they stayed there and Sarah had married somebody who was another emancipated Jew, then both of them, she and her husband and her brother, all would have had the second class status. So the same sort of way, like if she had married somebody who was a white Jew by the community standards, he would have been demoted to that second class status too. So again, lots of pressure not to have these legal marriages within the community. If that's the reason why Sarah and Isaac left, they weren't the first people of color who were irritated by these laws. In fact, there was a long-standing Jewish congregation of sorts, or brotherhood as it was called, a siva, called Darhei Yesharim, which was created by and for people who were in this emancipated Jewish category. So the Jews of color. It was a place where they could get together and not be discriminated against. And in the 1790s, this particular community decided, you know what? We could also just hold some services of our own and not have to sit in the bad seats, and we could get called up to the Torah. We could have all the same privileges that everybody else does. But when they went to create that new status as being a congregation, the European Jewish community clamped down on them and argued that they needed to be disbanded, that it was illegal for them to set up a separate synagogue. So the Jews of color petitioned the local government, claiming that it was illegal for them to be discriminated against in the way that they were being discriminated against, which was true. But the white Christians leading the colony sided with the European Jews. And by the time Sarah and Isaac arrived, that particular community was completely disbanded and had to be reabsorbed into the other congregations. So I think that helps us understand why there was this thriving community, people who were not interested in being oppressed, and why that wasn't available for them by the time that they arrived, that they had to go to the white run congregations to convert. So shortly after their conversion, Sarah and Isaac decide to leave the island. And Isaac travels back to the island of Barbados and rejoins the Jewish community now as a full-fledged member of Congregation Nida Israel, where his father was on the governance board. And after he returns to the island, he becomes engaged in these civil rights disputes, trying to get the right for Jews, including himself, to vote in local elections and to serve in the local legislature. And that ultimately proves completely unsuccessful and gets him actually kicked out of the synagogue as a result. I'm not going to talk more about that, but if you want to hear more about it, I talk about it at length in the book, and I'm happy to give you more information in the question and answer period as well. His sister, however, doesn't travel back to Barbados. She's still sort of very young. She's only about 13. And she instead, with the help of her father, goes north to London. And her reasons are complex for going to London. The first and foremost, London has a much larger Jewish community. So orders of magnitude bigger than anything in the Americas. And at the center of that community is Congregation Bevis Marks, which is, again, a Portuguese congregation like the one that her father belonged to. And in fact, when her father is in London on business, that's his home congregation. But she settles not in and around Bevis Marks, but rather south of London proper at the time, to where there's a number of elite Sephardic boarding schools where she attends school. So these are schools where both the fanciest Jews in London would have attended and sent their kids. This is where the Montefiore's went to school, as well as the Barrows, all the wealthiest Jews in London. But it's also where the movers and shakers of the Sephardic communities in the Caribbean sent their children back to London in order to go to school and how to learn to be the new leaders of the Sephardic world going forward. So these schools were places where she would have learned Jewish content. She would have learned not only some Hebrew, but also Spanish and Portuguese, so that she would understand the services at the Sephardic synagogue. as well as a little bit of French because that helped make you fancy. But she also would have learned how to do really important things that established her as part of the leaders of the Sephardic world. And that included things like learning to give charity to the poor as opposed to being somebody who received charity, and learning as a woman how to manage an entire household of servants as opposed to being a servant herself. And in this sense, that education is almost as important as her conversion for making her be able to become part of this new wealthy world of the top tier of Sephardic communities in the Atlantic world. While she's in London, she also has this beautiful little portrait miniature made. And these miniatures are only about 2 3/4 inches tall, but they're incredibly expensive to make. So they cost the same amount as a large portrait would, yet they're very much loved by Sephardic and Ashkenazi Jews living around London in the colonies. And that's because they often use them as part of the process of navigating marriages during this time period. So, particularly for the smaller communities, there might not be somebody else who is appropriate to marry in your own community, and you could send ahead your little portrait miniature to sort of help pave the way for a marriage. But even when you were in the same place as somebody else, these little portrait miniatures were really tokens of love and of ways of building affection between people. So we have like, you get a sense of like she has these huge eyes, which is part of the way that these miniatures are made. They're really attempting to draw us in and try and make us feel this sense of intimacy and devotion to the person. So, the other thing that made these miniatures so popular amongst the wealthier Jews in the Atlantic world was that they were very much about the rise of whiteness as part of wealthy elite identity. And we see this through the way that they use the ivory itself. So, ivory is particularly um, slippery as a substance, and it's hard to get the paint to stick. But the portrait makers actually use that as part of their strategy, that they like to use unpainted portions of the ivory in order to get this kind of magical glowing whiteness coming through creating these very thin sheets of ivory that are burnished with an iron, and they'll put a piece of silver behind them so the light comes in and reflects back with this kind of lovely glow that we see on Isaac Lopez Brandon's forehead and under his eyes. So again, very little paint even is necessary to have that ivory giving that message about whiteness. One of the things that was so interesting to me about Sarah's portrait was how different it was from the ways that people had made portraits of other multiracial women from the Atlantic world during this time period. So here's a portrait of an early multiracial woman from Suriname and one from New York. And you'll notice in both of them that the portrait maker has put these weird little lines on the woman's face and shoulders. And that's because, again, the the ivory itself is very slippery, and you kind of have two options. You can either use this little dot technique or little hatching technique. And all the miniature maker manuals say never use the line technique on women's faces because, as you can see, it makes them look very scratchy. And instead, you're supposed to use it for hair, for background, for clothing in order to give a kind of sense of texture. But here we see the bias of the miniature makers coming through. They're doing exactly what they're not supposed to do, and it's reflecting that vision of the women's skin is somehow flawed, not because that was the only way that they could make it, but just because that's sort of their bias coming through in the way that they're creating these portraits. Not so with Sarah's, that the miniature maker for her portrait follows the rules very carefully and only uses the little dot technique on her face. So you could have a change in color, but not have her end up looking all scratchy. But you can see that he does use that technique in the background and on her lovely, cute, curly hair and on her dress, again, exactly the way that he's supposed to be using it. So, like many miniatures from this time period that were used to create alliances between people, when Sarah's education's finished, her miniature goes off to Bevis Marks and finds another miniature, which belongs to an American Jew who's visiting from New York on business. And that miniature's owner is named Joshua Moses. And like Sarah, he belongs to one of these really important merchant families from the colonies. So his father is Isaac Moses, who is the wealthiest Jew and top Jewish merchant in New York during this time period. So, in many ways, the marriage between Joshua and Sarah is some ways a marriage between Isaac and Sarah's father, Abraham Rodriguez Brandon. And we know this in part because Abraham Rodriguez Brandon, Sarah's father, puts an enormous dowry down for his daughter to ensure that this marriage will go through. He gives her a dowry of £10,000, which, for people who are obsessed with Jane Austen, as I am, will recognize is the amount of money that Mr. Darcy gets each year. And I'm sure people read that, they're like, how much is £10,000? Is that a lot of money? And the answer is yes. That is a huge amount of money. It's about $30 million worth of purchasing money in today's economy. So just a huge, huge dowry. She is a phenomenal heiress. In contrast, Joshua's mother, Raina Levy, brought only $1,000, not even pounds, but $1,000 to her marriage, and that was considered like, ooh, so fancy. And here's Sarah bringing just like so much more money to the marriage. Also important to note that in the eyes of the London community at Bevis Marks, had Joshua and Sarah tried to get married about 15 years earlier, they wouldn't have been able to, not because Sarah wasn't good enough, but because Joshua wouldn't have been good enough, because he is one of those lowly Ashkenazi Jews. So by the time Sarah's gotten to London, the way they're thinking about race has changed. And her marriage contract, unlike had she been Suriname, does not say she's an emancipated Jew. It just says she's a convert, and it makes a big deal out of the fact that she, like her father, is a member of the Portuguese Jewish nation. So, in the eyes of Bevis Marks, she is elite. He, not so much. So he is allowed to marry her, but it's not like he's definitely marrying up in the eyes of that congregation. Shortly after they get married, they settle right around the tower near the docks where Joshua is doing his business. But before the year is out, Sarah is pregnant with her first child, and they decide not to stay in London, where neither of them have family, frankly, but instead to travel back across the ocean. And this time they go not to Barbados, but to New York, where Joshua's family lives on the lower end of Manhattan. So, to give you a sense of where things are, this is the location of Joshua's parents' house of Isaac and Raina Moses. This is Congregation Shereth Israel's first and second synagogue are located here. Here is Joshua and Sarah's house. And then shortly after they arrive, Sarah's brother, who by this point has been very rudely kicked out of the Barbadian congregation, travels north with their mother, and he becomes Joshua's business partner and even marries Joshua's sister. So this marriage to the Moses family becomes very important for the next set of transformations that the siblings undergo. So by the time that the census takers come around and they're writing down the race of the family, Sarah and all of her children are being considered white. And in addition, Isaac, when he comes up and asks to be admitted into the synagogue, again, we see something similar to London, where his Sephardic heritage is sort of trumping all other aspects of his identity. So we know not only is racism really prevalent in early New York during this time period, there's some pretty racist members of the synagogue voting board during this time period who are writing in newspapers things against African Americans all the time. And yet, when Isaac asked to become a member, that's not an issue. What's an issue is just that he is Jewish and that he's part of the Portuguese nation. So, again, really seeing how Jewish identity trumps those other aspects in this particular community in ways that it didn't in the Caribbean. Important to note that just like in London, where one of the witnesses to Sarah's marriage was a key member of the Barbados Jewish community, here too, the siblings, in spite of having come to New York and have traveled long distance, are surrounded by people from Barbados. In fact, Sarah's husband, Joshua, went to Talmud Torah with the grandson of their former enslaver. So they're like really closely intertwined with all the people who know about their past. And that's still not part of the discussion in terms of them becoming members of the community. Similarly, the Moses family stands up for Isaac and allows him to become not only a member of the congregation, but a naturalized citizen of the United States, something that people who were considered people of color could not have done during this time period. So here we sort of see it's important that they've traveled north to the United States, but actually is really dependent upon which city that they landed in. New York happens to have these kind of more fluid policies, but had they gone to a different state like New Orleans in Louisiana, then they would have actually had different understandings of race. So race is not standardized across the United States. They're really interacting on the ground with how things are developing. Before she reaches the age of 30, Sarah passes away, not before she's had one child, but 10 children, which I always am like, oof, so many children, so young. She does die in childbirth, which probably doesn't seem surprising if you have 10 children before you reach the age of 30, but she's also had two sets of twins, which help explain why she's had so many children so quickly. Of those 10 children, 9 survived to adulthood, and they, like their parents, become really important players in this New York Jewish community. Sarah's only daughter, Raina, becomes one of the fancy, wealthy Jewish women who's helping run and teach in the synagogue school. One of Sarah's sons becomes uh, one of the founders of the Jewish hospital and a famous surgeon for the US Army and a Civil War hero. Others of her sons become the Parnas, or president of the congregation. In addition, other sons marry into the elite families of the congregation, including the granddaughter of Gershom Mendes Satius, the most beloved early Hazan of Congregation Shereth Israel. So we really see that mobility of the previous generation paying off for the next generation in terms of their ability to become accepted and fully part of the Jewish community. Most of Sarah's descendants today come through this match with Selena Satius, the granddaughter of Gershom Mendes Satius, though a couple of her sons have illegitimate children as well, who they're descendants of today. One of the things that was really fascinating to me as I was sort of looking at what happened to their descendants was thinking about how that incredible mobility of the previous generation continued for the children of both Sarah and Isaac. So we find their children ending up not only across the Americas being involved in trade, but going off to China and living in China for a while and bringing Chinese products back to the United States. Some being involved in the War of 1848 with Mexico, some living down in Mexico involved in trade. Some go off to try and make it rich in the gold rush, which doesn't work out for them. Some are involved in the Civil War or living along the Texas-Mexican border. And a couple of them even get involved in an attempt to overthrow the government in Nicaragua, which also doesn't work out for them. But you see them involved in all these like key disputes in the 19th century, all these sort of hot spots. And again, this ability to move around, both in terms of merchant ability and in terms of their fighting in various armies, is largely dependent upon that racial mobility of the previous generation, because all of Sarah's sons who fight in the various disputes fight in on part of the white militia. So I'm going to go ahead and stop there, but I would love to get any questions from people. I'll stop sharing my screen.
Thank you so much, Laura. That was incredibly fascinating. Yeah, I'll encourage people to put their questions in the chat, or you can raise your hand. And I think we only have a few minutes for questions, but the advantage of being the organizer is that I get to ask the questions I have on my mind. Um, so I guess I'm really struck, especially Passover is coming, and I'm very, I'm always reminded that we read, in every generation, you have to look on yourself as if you had personally been enslaved, right? And I'm trying to sort of understand these communities of people that you just described who presumably had their seders every year, and yet were totally involved in this oppressive culture, right? That were people who owned slaves, were people who perpetuated bigotry against former enslaved people. Like, I don't even know what my question is, but yeah, how do you grapple with that?
Yeah, I think particularly since a number of the people um, in the Sephardic community in particular, I mean, obviously the people in the Ashkenazi community are also escaping pogroms and whatnot and still get involved in slavery. But also the people in the Sephardic community often are coming directly from Iberia and escaping the Inquisition and then immediately turn around and are sort of oppressing other people. But I do think that it gives us a sense of how naturalized the idea that it was okay to enslave people was for many people during this time period. We even have people within the community of people who had been enslaved themselves and get their freedom, and then they also end up having slaves. And so I feel like that's something that is pretty ubiquitous. And in that sense, it's kind of remarkable that people figure out that's not okay, right? Like, obviously, if you are enslaved, it seems like pretty clear that you would feel like not a good idea. And yet, even then, that um, in that community, have people who immediately just try to gain privileges for themselves. So it's hard to understand. I mean, I do think that, 100 years from now, people will look back at things that we do and be like aghast that we do the kinds of things that we do too, right? We can all think of things that, um, if you're a vegetarian and you look around at what people do to animals, you probably 100 years from now, when people have figured out better fake meats, people will be like, they did what? Like, again, not that enslaved people and animals are the same thing at all, but I do think that there is that way in which the larger morals of society do make certain things seem acceptable that from a distance or just feel like, what? How could that possibly be?
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. I also wanted to ask about. I was fascinated about this world traveling family. And what's clear, you describe a world traveling community, right? That you have people going from the Caribbean to London to New York and back to the Caribbean, I'm sure. Um, is my just understanding of how much people moved around in the early 19th century just wrong, or are these exceptional people, or is it sort
Yeah.
of both?
Yeah. So I think that was one of the things that for my first book of Jewish studies many years ago, the Messianism book, was really shocking to me. Was I had been working on Native American communities both for my dissertation and for the first book that I published, and in those communities, the people largely stayed put, that they didn't keep on migrating all around. And when I started working on the Messianism book, I was planning to work on the Jewish community in Newport, Rhode Island. And I would come up with a list of people, and then the next census, half of them would be gone. And I'd be like, where did my people go? And then the next census, they'd be back. And I was like, and now they're back. And the next census, another group of people would be gone. So it was very surprising to me of how mobile people were in terms of shifting around the Atlantic world. And the answer of where they went to is they often went to the Caribbean or they went to Europe, or so they really moved around in these patterns of the different port towns in the Caribbean and Amsterdam and London and Hamburg, and then in the places in North America like um, Charleston and Philadelphia, New York. So you really do have a way in which those port towns are their own community for Jews across these different spaces. And there is differences between each of them, but they do have this kind of cohesion that's a little bit unexpected, I think, from a later
Hmm,
perspective.
fascinating, fascinating. I also wanted to ask about you mentioned that a New York conversion was a bad conversion, and a Suriname conversion was a good one. What was the cultural context that made something a good conversion versus a bad conversion?
Yeah, so one of the things that made um, places like Suriname and Curacao different from New York or Philadelphia is that they had much larger Jewish communities. They had a standing Beit Din. All the people on the Beit Din would have some kind of ordination. They had yeshivot where people were getting trained in terms of Jewish law. So just a really different kind of Jewish infrastructure than places like New York or Philadelphia during this time period. And so you often see notes from people in New York and Philadelphia asking other communities for advice. Particularly Curacao is in some ways the mother community after about 1800 for most of the people in the Americas, that they really, when people have a question, they turn to Curacao
Mm,
for advice. So that's part of it. But we see this in other parts of Jewish life during the colonial period too, that even in terms of kosher, food, that this happens too, that again we sort of think, I think of New York was always somehow the center of Jewish life, but before 1825 totally not. But they did, both New York and Philadelphia produced a lot of food stuff that people in those larger communities in the Caribbean wanted, where they were more likely to keep kosher. And we find these very funny notes back from rabbis and hazans in the Caribbean complaining about the lack of proper kosher supervision and the food that was sent to them, and with really detailed information about here's what you need to do differently and get it right. And I can't believe that I'm buying fish from you when you keep on messing things up. So, you get this sense of our sense of where um, Jewish authority lies is just so different for this time period.
that's fascinating. That's fascinating. Well, I will pass along as well. Several people have sent me private comments just thanking you for your talk and saying this is just fascinating content, which it certainly is. And I think also think we're about time. I want to thank you so much, Dr. Liebman. This
Sure.
is just a wonderful topic and totally um, changes how I view the history of the Jewish people, which is very interesting. For everyone, I'm posting a link to the Beth Shalom speaker series. Our next speaker will be after Passover, which, as far as I'm concerned, is 1,000 years in the future. So I have no idea what it actually is, but you can check it out on the website. You can get Once We Were Slaves on White Whale's bookstore. And I've also linked to Dr. Liebman's website. Thank you so much for being here tonight, everyone, and especially you, Laura.
Take care. Have a great night.
Good night, everyone.